In the last light of an age that had seemed unchangeable, entire cities fell quiet as if someone had taken a hand from a vast clock. Roads that once carried legions and merchants grew over with grass. Empires contracted, boundaries blurred, and from that erosion, something new began to emerge. The story that follows spans roughly 1,000 years across Europe, from the late Roman world to the eve of global voyages, and it explains how collapse became invention. In the 5th century by the Mediterranean and in the courts of river valleys, governors and generals gave way to a cast of new actors. Kings, bishops, monks, and warriors would compete to remake authority, and the choices they made still shape laws, borders, and beliefs today. Over the next scenes, we will move through stability, collapse, migrations, reassembly, and eventual expansion, tracking cause and effect at every step. The narrative rests on chronicles, material traces, and modern scholarship, and it alternates between sweeping political shifts and the small decisions of named people who lived through them. But to understand the shape of medieval Europe, we must begin at the edge of the earlier world, where roads still remembered the footfalls of an empire. At the height of Roman stability, the Mediterranean world enjoyed common law, coinage, and a network of roads that knit cities to provinces. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Pax Romana offered security for trade caravans, artisanal workshops, and for an emerging religion that promised a new social language. Christian communities grew within urban centers and along communication arteries, slowly acquiring organization and moral authority. The narrative of institutional continuity matters because when municipal budgets shrank and frontier garrisons thinned, the church retained a form of social infrastructure. Bishops collected taxes in some towns, monastery scriptoria preserved texts, and the Latin liturgy standardized rituals across regions. The coexistence of imperial bureaucrats and local clergy created redundancy that in part explained why, when central fiscal capacity faltered, other institutions stepped into the void. The smell of oil lamps, the hiss of a quill on parchment, and the metallic clink of coins in a chest formed an everyday soundtrack of a world that still believed in ordered hierarchy, even as pressures mounted elsewhere. Economic strains, repeated plagues, and military overreach eroded imperial authority until the Western apparatus could no longer enforce its claims. In the late 4th and 5th centuries, inflation and the cost of defending elongated frontiers undermined provincial tax bases. Severe winters and harvest failures in some seasons amplified local famine. The Gothic Wars, crossings of the Danube, and the push of groups labeled barbarian in Roman sources were not a single cataclysm, but a concatenation of movements and negotiations. In 476, a youth named Romulus ascended a throne that had the name without the power. His deposition was a symbol more than an instant cause. In that same time, a monk named Aldrich, who later became a key observer, traced the smell of smoke from burning storehouses and the sound of hurried prayers in a provincial basilica. Soldiers deserted paymasters, local landholders raised private bands for defense, and small centers of power began to look like sovereign states. The visible thread was fragmenting, but hidden threads of administration, law, and ritual persisted and adapted. Where Roman arms withdrew, local rulers consolidated. Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Hispania, and Franks in Gaul carved spheres of influence that borrowed Roman law and Roman titles while adapting to rural economies. Cities shrank, villas and manor units became central nodes for agricultural production. Trade patterns shifted from wide networks to more localized exchange, and textile workshops migrated toward towns with reliable river transport. Count Odo and Aquitaine negotiated truces with neighboring warlords and with bishops to secure grain routes. Theodoric and other Gothic leaders accepted consular robes while ruling through Gothic warbands. For peasants, the rhythm of the year, the feel of the plow, and the taste of salted pork determined survival more than imperial edicts. In these changes, one sees continuity disguised as transformation. Latin laws endured in codes, Christian institutions mediated land disputes, and elites who claimed new barbarian legitimacy still relied on Roman fiscal practices. The 6th and 7th centuries broadened the map of new powers and external threats. The Eastern Roman Empire, seated in Constantinople, attempted to project influence in Italy and the Balkans, while new faith communities and polities rose in the south and east. The rapid expansion of Islam from the 7th century reshaped the Mediterranean, taking North Africa and piercing into Iberia within a generation. In the West, a new figure emerged whose battlefield decisions reverberated across centuries. Charles Martel, a leader who rallied warriors in the fields of Gaul, met in a moment that would be framed as defensive salvation. The clash near Tours is often narrated as a single turning point, but it represented a wider pattern of regional defense and coalition building. Meanwhile, the Carolingian lineage consolidated power through itinerant courts, dense coronation rituals, and monastic reform. When Charles the Great received imperial coronation in Rome, it was both an assertion of continuity with Roman authority and a reinvention that fused Frankish military efficacy with Christian symbolism. The scene of the coronation carried sensory weight: the fragrant smoke of incense, the glint of gold crowns, the hush of 1,000 voices, and the cold marble underfoot as a pope pronounced a new emperor. A chorus of external raids and internal adaptation pushed European societies toward feudalized structures. Norse longships appeared on coasts and rivers, inserting raiders and settlers in places from England to the Black Sea. Magyar horsemen thundered across plains, and seafaring Muslim adventurers struck Mediterranean communities. Fortified mottes and wooden palisades punctuated landscapes, and mounted knights developed from local retinues into a military aristocracy. Lords like Rollo negotiated land for loyalty, building stone keeps in later decades. Vassalage imposed a web of personal bonds where land tenure secured military service and protection. The tactile reality, the sting of cold iron, the roughness of chainmail against a rider, the taste of barley and salted fish in a winter ration. For many communities, the castle kept them alive, and castle life reshaped local economies and social hierarchies. By the 10th and 11th centuries, some regions began to stabilize. Figures like Alfred in England and Ottonian rulers in Central Europe rebuilt administrative capacities and invested in currency reform. Norman strategies of conquest and settlement exported a hybrid of martial and administrative techniques that accelerated urban revitalization. Craftspeople congregated in market towns where the smell of leather, the clang of hammer on anvil, and the color of dyed cloth drew merchants and buyers. Cathedral schools and early cathedral chapters nurtured literate clerks, and a slow revival of long-distance commerce followed river systems and Mediterranean ports. Local identity strengthened alongside renewed interregional ties, producing the conditions for later institutional expansions. The High Middle Ages introduced a wider era of economic growth, religious mobilization, and new educational structures. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, trade fairs buzzed with Italian merchants from cities like Genoa and Venice, and universities emerged where scholars argued in cloistered halls over texts recovered from monasteries. Church reform movements sought to enforce clerical discipline and centralize papal authority, leading to tense confrontations between monarchs and popes. Crusading banners crossed the sea and produced a surge of contact and conflict with the Eastern Mediterranean, while the culture of knighthood fused religious fervor and martial identity. At market and monastery alike, the sensory world mattered. The grit of market dust, the smell of spiced wine, the rustle of vellum pages in a study, and the echo of processional chants in stone churches. This period saw an expansion of institutions that both unified and polarized Europe. Crisis arrived in the 14th century in a form few expected. The Black Death swept through ports and inland settlements, cutting mortality by large percentages in some regions. The pestilence accelerated labor shortages, raising wages for survivors and undermining rigid feudal expectations. Peasant uprisings, migratory movements, and legal innovations followed, challenging old land tenures. In the same centuries, technological innovations in shipbuilding and navigation, along with political consolidation into stronger monarchies, prepared certain states for overseas expansion. The result was paradoxical.
From demographic collapse came economic and social possibilities that propelled Europe toward global engagement. The next sections examine landmark events and human decisions that shaped these shifts, and we will look closely at a few scenes that people still remember. The deposition scene in 476 is often described as a single act. Here, a condensed drama is shown through a dialogue that spans the cramped chamber of a provincial palace. Aldrich sat in the shadow and watched as the actor spoke. "Young Romulus," Orestes said, voice brittle, "we have no coins to send to the legions." Romulus answered, quiet and puzzled, "What remains of Rome if the soldiers go?" Odo, a local magnate, leaned forward and whispered, "We
will not let the town become a prize." Orestes replied, "Then you must bind with new oaths." Romulus, touching the edge of a toga, asked, "Are my titles only fabric and sound?" Odo smiled without humor. "Titles command only when men obey." Aldrich cleared his throat and said, "Faith and law outlive crowns if care is taken." Romulus looked at Aldrich. "Can the bishop save the city?" Aldrich felt the weight of incense and replied, "He can keep the lamps lit and the records kept, and sometimes that is enough." Orestes stood, and with a sound like a shuttered door, left the chamber. The sense of oil and old parchment lingered as Romulus realized the crown was a symbol more than an engine. At roughly 1/3 of this narrative, there is a moment to pause and reflect with the community watching. If this account surprised you, you are not alone. Which turning point do you think mattered most in shaping medieval Europe? Type 1 for the fall of the Western Empire, 2 for mass migrations, 3 for the Black Death, or 4 for the coronation that sought to restore imperial order? And tell us why. Your comments help other viewers see diverse perspectives and help guide future episodes where we dive deeper into sources and debates. They help build a community that treats history as a conversation. Now, returning to the chronological thread, we examine how battlefield choices and local politics combined to produce continental outcomes. The confrontation near Tours is reimagined as a field conversation before a clash. Charles Martel adjusted a cloak weighted by dust and dirt. "We hold here because if we lose this valley, the roads will be open," he said. Duke Odo responded, "My men tire, but if you will hold the center, we can flank." A peasant conscript named Guillaume, teeth chattering from fear, asked, "Will God favor our spears?" A cleric named Fulbert crossed himself and said, "Prayer is with you, stand steady." A veteran cavalry leader named Reynold spat and said, "Show them the iron and they will learn to fear." Martel looked toward the horizon where banners moved like darker clouds, and breathed in the smell of sweat and horseflesh. "Then we will teach them," he said. Orders were passed, shields clanged, and the ground seemed to hold its breath. The clash that followed combined shock and discipline, and, by the dusk, survivals and bodies told a story later told as a turning point. Feudal arrangements hardened through a series of local negotiations. Rollo and other Norse leaders swapped raids for lands and law, establishing new polities through oaths and marriage. Rulers like Charlemagne attempted to systematize taxation, law, and education across vast territories, using itinerant courts and religious reform to unify diverse peoples. Charlemagne's coronation in Rome was staged with heavy ritual. The Pope invoked scripture, the crowd murmured, and a crown was set upon a head to send a message of restored authority. In a dialogue staged at the palace, the Pope said, "By this act you will bind Western Christendom." Charlemagne answered, steady and weary, "I will defend the church and law." An advisor named Einhard observed, "A crown changes how men look at you and how you look at the world." The clatter of coins and the rustle of traveling cloaks framed the moment. The Viking period offers moments of surprise and adaptation. In one coastal village, a farmer named Leif watched long ships appear like black teeth on the horizon. "They come for our grain," his wife Ira said, breathless from running. Leif grabbed a rusty spear and said to his neighbor, "We cannot meet them at sea, so hide what you can." The raiders, led by a figure named Harold, landed with the smell of brine and smoke in their hair. "We are men who trade and take," Harold told the villagers. The elder priest named Brother Martin stepped forward and offered bread, which stunned both sides with a smell of yeast and hospitality. Negotiations, threats, and marriages followed in some regions, and in others, longships returned to carry captives or settlement. In these encounters, you can feel the salt on a sailor's tongue and the splinter of ore in a cramped hand. Moment of tension 1. A bell tolled as Romulus left the throne room without a retinue. He heard whispers follow him like rats. Inside his chest, a memory of a father who had been a minor official urged him to cling to pageantry because pageantry might preserve respect. He stood before a mirror of polished bronze, hands shaking, and decided to remove the purple robe and walk among the townspeople without it. The choice was humiliation disguised as humility and a gamble that the town would accept new forms of authority. Moment of tension 2. On the plains before Tours, a rider recognized a flash of terror in his son's eyes. The rider felt an impulse to flee to preserve family, yet a memory of a tutor who taught duty held him in place. He breathed the dusty air, tasted grit, and turned back to the line. The decision to stand created a ripple that would be spoken of for generations. Moment of tension 3. When the pestilence entered a port, a physician named Wateo stood over a child and smelled the damp breath of death. He wanted to run with the other merchants, but also recalled a vow to heal. He covered his face, wrapped linen around his hands, and chose to remain to count the dead and record names. That act of witnessing became a source for future records and claims about mortality rates. Aldrich is the central human observer whose backstory threads through this 1,000-year span. He was born to a smallholder family by a river, the son of a cooper and a midwife, and learned from childhood to read the sky for weather and the ledger for store accounts. As a youth, he apprenticed with a local scribe named Matthias, tracing letters by candlelight and learning how a single entry could decide whether a family ate that winter. A plague in his adolescence took his mother and hardened his sense of duty. Seeking meaning, he entered a monastery and became a copyist and chronicler, recording transactions and tales. In adult life, he served as steward for Bishop Emmerich and later as an itinerant counselor to Count Odo, using his knowledge of land records to mediate disputes. His memory of the feel of vellum and the smell of ink informed a conviction that institutions could be conserved even when armies failed. He kept lists of gifts, witnessed oaths, and taught novices how to bind a book so that knowledge could travel beyond a collapsing city. In quiet moments, he remembered the taste of barley porridge shaped by his mother, and he wrote letters that would survive him. Those letters formed the micro-thread through which many macro shifts are seen. Throughout these centuries, many named figures shaped outcomes. Emperor Romulus Augustulus symbolically ceded a title that no longer carried troops. Odo of Aquitaine negotiated local defense and later stood as kingmaker. Charles Martel organized cavalry and forged alliances that stopped incursions in critical moments. Charlemagne, who forged a new Western empire, created standards for law and learning. Rollo traded pillage for land and laid foundations for Normandy. Harold and Olaf led men who reshaped coastal societies. Sister Matilda preserved hospital care in a charity house and recorded names of the dead. Ibn al-Rashid, a learned Andalusi merchant, transmitted scientific texts and commodities across the Mediterranean, reminding us that medieval Europe was never isolated. Each of these people left sensory traces that chroniclers recorded: the clink of coin, the rustle of manuscript, the scent of incense, the taste of victory, and the texture of worn leather. As the late Middle Ages approached, economies and polities transformed in ways that made oceanic voyages thinkable.
Shipbuilders refined hull designs, merchants pooled capital, monarchs centralized tax systems, and intellectual curiosity sought maps beyond known seas. The Black Death had reduced labor supply, shifting bargaining power to working people and pressing elites to incentivize productivity. Guilds regulated quality and training, universities fostered mathematical knowledge needed for navigation, and city-states accumulated wealth that fueled expeditions. The sensory world of ports is telling. Tar on ropes, citrus on sailors' tongues, the creak of a rudder under moonlight. These sensations preceded global movement. In conclusion, looking from ruined forum to fortified keep, we see not a simple decline, but an uneven reinvention. Roads that once hosted legions became the lanes of market towns. Churches that once followed Roman law reshaped law and literacy. Feudal bonds introduced personal responsibility where central authority receded, and later state formation and commercial networks layered new structures atop older ones. The continuum from empire to kingdom to nation is marked by adaptation, loss, and creativity. If you found this journey illuminating, subscribe to follow episodes that interrogate sources, spotlight microhistories, and bring specialists into conversation. The past is not a closed book, but a map of choices we still inherit. 1 month later, the landscape showed signs of immediate change. In several counties, markets reopened with a different rhythm, as merchants who survived adjusted prices upward to reflect labor scarcity. Local lords negotiated new rents with peasants whose bargaining power had increased. In some villages, this meant better prospects for smallholders, while in others it sparked constraints and legal revisions. A monastery where Aldrich had copied letters found some of its novices missing to the plague and had to recruit from nearby parishes. The echoing refectory lost its regular voices, and the scent of broth no longer masked the ash of fewer fires. Bishop Emmerich, in his diocesan letter, recorded altered tithes and recommended measured responses to wandering laborers. In coastal towns, shipwrights reported a small decline in cargo, but also a surge in demand for repairs as older vessels were reforged for longer voyages. Contemporary letters emphasized grief and pragmatic negotiation. People compared losses and recalibrated expectations, and the immediate shock gave way to local improvisation. 3 months on, changes deepened and spread. Labor shortages pushed wages higher across broader regions and caused tensions with lords who felt their incomes eroded. In some places, vassals refused to serve for old allowances and demanded commutation in coin. Urban centers saw revived craft production because guilds adapted training to maintain quality while allowing accelerated apprenticeships. In a notable case, Count Odo conducted a regional council to regulate grain flow after reports of speculative hoarding. The smell of stored wheat and the heat of granaries became central in negotiation scenes. Religious institutions began to codify care for widows and orphans more systematically, and Sister Matilda organized a network of small infirmaries supported by charitable alms. The intellectual scene changed as scholars debated causes of calamity and argued for new measures in public health. Merchants like Ibn al-Rashid, who traded spices, documented shifting demand and adjusted shipping routes to avoid ports with repeated outbreaks. Political consolidation in some kingdoms accelerated because rulers used emergency taxes to finance standing defenses and mounted expeditions that required steady revenue. 6 months later, the social landscape had entered a new phase. Some settlements had instituted permanent legal innovations that persisted beyond temporary emergency measures. Labor contracts transformed into written obligations in several locales, and courts began to record these agreements more consistently. Certain towns invested in market infrastructure and improved docks to attract merchants. The taste of foreign spices, once scarce, became more common in urban diets because trade adapted and merchants consolidated routes. A new class of urban entrepreneurial households emerged, blending craft management with long-distance trade, and they came to rival rural elites in influence. In regions where lords adapted by offering greater security and regular payments, peasant flight decreased and agriculture stabilized.
States that invested in administrative reforms saw increased tax compliance and capacity to sponsor explorations that would later
finance overseas voyages. Aldrich, older now, wrote a reflective letter noting that institutions had plasticity. The monastery that had once merely copied texts now coordinated relief and recorded demographic shifts. The memory of death remained vivid, but survivors converted grief into institution building that changed material incentives and political possibilities. From depopulated fields to fortified towns, from monastic scriptoria to emerging universities, the transformation of medieval Europe was not the disappearance of an order, but a reinvention. The institutions, rituals, and conflicts of that thousand-year span became the scaffolding for later expansions that reached oceans and continents. If you want more episodes that trace single threads across centuries, subscribe and join a community that reads the past as an argument about possibilities. Remember, the past is less a museum of facts than a living map that guides how we understand the present.